Good evening. Well, I'll start off just by introducing our panel. On the far left, we have Isabel Hilton, who will be known to many of you as the editor of one of the associate editors of Open Democracy, and also the editor of ChinaDiary.net. Dialogue. And we have Lindsey, whose film you've just seen. On my right, we have Brad Adams, who's the Asia Director for Human Rights Watch. And further on my right, we have Dr. Wenguang Shao from the Phoenix Chinese News. I'm going to start this evening by asking Lindsey just to add a little bit to the film that we've just seen. In there, we say that now the West is annoyed because they are no longer the only game in town for African leaders. As someone who spent a lot of time looking at this from both sides, both in Africa and in China, how big a change has Chinese investment and Chinese involvement in Africa brought?
Okay, China is not the biggest investor in Africa. The Americans are still the biggest investor in Africa. And when it comes to oil, the Americans are still, they're very engaged. If you take somewhere like Angola, the Americans understand that the Chinese are coming in and that the Chinese are providing loans on very preferential terms to the Angolans and don't ask any questions about corruption, human rights, all the rest of it. The Americans are very aware of that, and they are also upping their game. So I think that there is a contest there, particularly in the countries where there are a lot of oil resources. But I think that one of the things which is important, which I have established from the work I've done both in Africa and in China, is that it's not just about resources. That China is also involved in Africa, and increasingly involved in Africa, because they want their companies to become multinational companies. And that Africa is a place where you can practice. And Chinese businessmen have said this to me. They said, we know that we don't have multinational companies with the same level of expertise and reach that multinational companies which were originally American or European have. And we have to learn how to do this. So Charles Liu, for example, who you saw there from Holly Pharmaceutical, he now has an office in Kenya and he has an office in Tanzania. He says, I'm learning how to run a company that's based in Beijing but has 2 other offices in other countries. And when I've learned how to do that and how to make all of that work, then I'm going to start going elsewhere. And yes, I want to go to the European and American market as well. So Africa is like a proving ground for China. I would also, I suppose the other thing to say is that I think that on the oil, it's not just a short-term issue. That China isn't there just because its oil consumption is so big now and they need to get all this oil in barrels. That they also see the oil business as their long-term future, in that oil consumption in China is doubled between 1995 to 2005 and it's expected to increase by 130% by 2025. So they are in there for exploration, for pipelines, for all sorts of long-term investments, as well as just trying to get oil out now. So that's a major part of China's long-term strategy. And so the final thing I would say is that what I note is how well organized and thought through China's strategy is, diplomatically and economically. Specifically, I'm talking about Africa, but I think that you could look at other parts of the world as well. And it was a Kenyan paper which I read the other day said that the problem is that China has an Africa policy, but Africa doesn't have a China policy. And I think that is a really big issue for Africa. How is Africa dealing with China? Our African governments should be a willing buyer, willing seller, as Museveni said. They should be able to deal on an equal basis. But at the moment, I don't think that they are. And I don't think that African governments and African countries are getting the kind of deal that they should get in order that this new investment and this new interest in Africa can actually improve the lives of African people. And that, I think, is probably the biggest issue in the coming years.
Thanks for that. At that point, a lot of the coverage for the last year has focused to a great extent on China's growing influence in Africa. But that's not necessarily by any means the only area in which China's influence is growing. And perhaps, as you said, while China has an Africa policy, it also has a policy which stretches far beyond that. At which point I'd like to bring you in, Isabel, to speak a little bit more broadly. Is what we've seen across the board in terms of what Lindsey's outlined with Africa's experience of Chinese interest, investment and engagement, is that going on further afield as well?
It's going on globally. I mean, there is what's going on around the world at the moment is this, what a friend of mine calls the giant sucking sound of China's need for resources of all kinds. And these are mineral resources, they're energy resources, they're also fish. You know, the pirate fishing, in fact, off the African coast is largely Chinese, for timber, massive deforestation in Africa, again, largely attributable to illegal logging, which goes to China. The same is true in Indonesia. If you look at Latin America and you look at the growth rates that Latin America has had in the last 2 or 3 years, after quite a long period of stagnation, suddenly you're getting growth of 5-6%. If you look at where the Chinese are, again, it's chasing largely minerals, but not exclusively. So Hugo Chávez's warm relationship with Hu Jintao, which led him to say that Bolivar was a Maoist, not noticing that Hu Jintao isn't a Maoist, but anyway, so there are all sorts of misperceptions going on. In Peru, one of the biggest Chinese steel companies is operating in Peru, has a plant in Peru. And similar problems emerge. I mean, I don't want to sort of launch this by giving the impression that this is all a bad thing. For one thing, China's need for resources is entirely legitimate. China is developing. This is fine. For another, in Africa, I don't think the colonial record is such that it's particularly easy to point the finger. However, we are where we are, and one of the issues in Africa is whether the model of development that China is pursuing and is therefore exporting is a sustainable one, and whether it's in the long run good for the countries that it's in. China's model of development is completely unsustainable. It's been in the last 2 decades a develop first, worry about everything else later. It's extraordinarily wasteful. It takes 3 times as many resources to produce 1 unit of GDP in China than it does in India, even. 5 times as many as in Japan, 6 times as many as in the US. This is a model of development which is exhausting everything very, very fast. The Chinese themselves are trying to bring that back into some kind of balance, but the behavior of their companies in Africa and in Latin America tends to pursue that model of development, particularly where local regulation is weak. Environmentally, it tends to be extremely damaging, fairly wasteful, and as Lindsey has mentioned, there are no conditions to Chinese investment and aid of the human rights, governance, transparency, etc., variety, so that desperate dictators like Mugabe, situations like Sudan, get a no questions asked massive injection of aid. And though China says that China doesn't interfere in the internal politics of any of the countries that it touches, the fact is that its presence and the way its investment is used is an interference, and it's an interference on behalf of the ruling power universally. Whereas China in the 50s and 60s was supporting liberation movements, China now is supporting dictators. So it is an interference. It's simply going in a different direction. For instance, just one small example, it sells weapons to Sudan, sells weapons to Mugabe. It sold a radio jamming station to Zimbabwe, which is on a military base outside the capital, and is used to jam the broadcasts of political opposition groups. So, what's interference? On a wider level, in Latin America, again, the impact in Latin America has largely been that a subcontinent which has, for a couple of 100 years, seen no other option but domination by the United States, suddenly does have an option. It has an economic and a political option. China's image in Latin America, and I think largely in Africa, is of a successful third world country that's found a different model of development. And a lot of the popular political leaders in Latin America have, to some extent, I think, the impression, or try to use the impression, that this is a model that can be followed in their countries. This is quite unlikely. But it's an appealing model. It's an appealing model to Brazil, and it's an appealing model to Venezuela. At the same time, you're beginning to see, a bit in Africa and certainly in Latin America, real questioning of the terms of trade that are being established, which look, pretty much like Manchester in the 19th century. It's the purchase of raw materials and it's the export of cheap manufactured goods, which have a pretty devastating effect on local economies, on local manufacture. So you are beginning to get reflections in these countries which say, well, hang on a minute, is this really all that good for us at this point? Shouldn't we be having, more tariff barriers, more protection? I've probably gone on long enough, sorry.
That's fine. One thing that's very much emerged from the first two speakers is that there's an ominous undertone to all discussions of expanding Chinese influence. In looking through things ahead of this evening, I saw China described, compared to various different cartoon characters. One cartoon character was Bambi. That was very quickly rejected. The other cartoon character was Godzilla. And another one talked about China as being the 80-pound gorilla in the room, the King Kong, and you needed to decide how to respond to it in that way. If we look at another emerging economic superpower, another economic miracle like India, which in the not-too-distant future will have a similar population and a similar economic clout, the coverage of India is very different. I'd like to perhaps go to you, Brad, to explain a little bit about why you think so much of what we consume in terms of news about China and analysis of China comes to us with such an ominous tone.
Okay, I'll try to be non-responsive first and then answer your question. I just want to say that what's happening in Africa has been rolled out in Southeast Asia over the last 5, 7, 10 years. It wasn't rolled out in quite the same way, but China has been very active in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand. Everywhere there's been an opportunity. When King Gyanendra staged a coup in Nepal a couple of years ago, the Chinese hopped on a plane and offered him military aid. The king turned it down because the Indians said, if you do that, you're finished. But they have had an opportunistic foreign policy in the region. They told Hun Sen that if he didn't want to cooperate with the UN on Khmer Rouge trials, they would replace dollar for dollar any foreign aid that was cut off because Hun Sen wasn't cooperating. They've done this publicly. Hun Sen reported this fact, actually, to assembled diplomats. So what's happening in Africa has been tested. It has worked to some extent because providing aid without strings has pleased the leaders of countries in the region. It has cemented alliances, and we've seen how it's protected some countries. The example of Burma at the Security Council recently, where China vetoed a resolution on Burma, will have heartened many recipients of Chinese aid, because this is a natural byproduct of the relationship that has been developed ever more deeply between China and Burma. I personally think this is all going to end in tears in Africa, and I think it's evident why it will. The interest that China has in Africa, as Isabel and Lindsey mentioned, is essentially an economic one. Economic actors have never shown themselves to be ethical or moral in their dealings anywhere, and for the same reasons that colonialism had a bad name in Africa, and then the neo-colonial policies of the West had a bad reputation in Africa, the Chinese policies ultimately are going to have a bad reputation in Africa. Remember, what we're hearing now in this film that Lindsey did and in other comments is this sort of euphoria among the leadership in these countries because, wow, somebody's coming to us with a blank check, and we don't have to do anything in return. But those are the same people who had a different critique of the imperialist strategies in Africa decades ago. Very same people in many cases. Interestingly, Thabo Mbeki actually gave voice to this before Hu Jintao came to South Africa. He said, we appreciate what they're doing, I'm paraphrasing, but we are worried about the colonial nature of this enterprise and whether it's really going to be an attempt to assist us or whether it's going to be an attempt to repeat the colonial policies of the past that we've experienced. There are some other complications. I have been to factories that Chinese companies own in Asia, and they are by far the most horrible factories I visited. And I visited dozens and dozens of factories. You can go through a hierarchy of what factory conditions are like owned by different investors, and the Chinese, mainland Chinese, are by far the worst. We're talking about people still being locked into factories during work hours, being paid late or not at all. We're talking about violence against factory workers inside factories by Chinese management, because this, frankly, is how it's done in many parts of China. When you talk to them, they look astonished that you would have anything negative to say about the way the factories are working. Just for example, in Cambodia, because of U.S. garment quotas, the industry more or less cleaned itself up in the late 1990s to be able to export to the Gap and whoever else they were making products for, Walmart. The Chinese factories that were sending their products back to China made no changes whatsoever. They're sort of living in a parallel universe. There's another factor here that I think is going to be accentuated in Africa. People who have spent a lot of time in China know there's deep-seated racism in China. It's very deep. It's against white people, it's against other people, but it's most pernicious against black people. I think there's going to be a real culture clash in Africa. And there's going to be some real problems with how Chinese bosses treat their workers. And I don't think this will be a small issue. And I don't really see how China can manage this issue because there's so many diverse interests. The last thing I would say is we are now facing a time when China is using its foreign policy clout, its newfound wealth, its status as a country where Western powers are going to them asking for foreign policy favors from them. I mean, it used to be that if Bush or his predecessors or Blair or his predecessors or Chirac or Schroeder, if they went to China or the Chinese leadership came to them, the top of the list was human rights. Human rights is more or less an afterthought. It has to be in the communique because there are domestic constituencies in these countries that require it, but it's not the main source of their discussions. The Chinese know this. They know that they're in the catbird seat on North Korea and other places, and they are aggressively attempting to undermine international standards. They're not giving this aid with blank checks only because it makes African leaders happy. They're doing it because they're trying to create a new international order. And we can see this in many places, not least at the Human Rights Council, new Human Rights Council in Geneva, where the Chinese have a very considered strategy of forming a new majority in this Human Rights Council to be anti-human rights.
Thank you. What I'd like to know, Dr. Wen, we just heard three very articulate voices speaking, giving us a very articulate version of Western criticisms of the growth of Chinese influence or Chinese visions of a new world order. As someone who's working in London and seeing this kind of coverage all of the time, how does that seem to you, and how much of this criticism would come as a shock to both to Chinese policymakers and to people looking at it from the other side, i.e. people in China itself?
It's probably not only people in China, but also people, Chinese all over the world, who are exposed to this sort of attacks and bias. I'm based in London, and I think a lot of criticism against the Chinese business practices in Africa and in many other parts of the world are entirely justified, because remember, in Africa, about 40% of the commercial activities and businesses, trade and investments are done by small non-government companies. A lot of them actually used to be mine operators in Shanxi or some other provinces where conditions are horrible, just as horrible. So China, given that kind of background, has a long way to go in terms of running the businesses according to international standards. And that's why there is such a big gap when Chinese companies try to go abroad, trying to to be integrated into the international economic and business practices and systems. But having said that, I think the very fact that 48 countries were represented in Beijing, heads of state and government, could never have happened in London, could never have happened in Washington, D.C., could never have happened probably also in Berlin, but recently in Agam, African heads of state and government were received by China as part of their African summit. But I want to say that the Chinese went to Africa originally not to make money, but to make revolution. And the reasons why they were giving those aids and building railways and construction projects and so on and so forth, well beyond the capabilities and the welfare of the Chinese people, was not because they want to make money, was not because they want to be new colonialists in Africa. We're talking about the 60s and 70s and even late into the 80s. They were there because they believed that somehow the Chinese and the African countries came from the same historical experience, that they were treated badly in the 19th century, just as African countries were treated badly, slaughtered and massacred in the scramble for Africa. That's why they believe that the however you judge Mao Zedong's philosophy or policy, that the Chinese were part of the developing world, part of the developing countries and third world. And they had to be together, supporting each other and so on and so forth. But after the Cultural Revolution, there was a downturn. There was an ebb in the Chinese aid projects to Africa, because then Deng Xiaoping launched this reform and opening up campaign. And the new policies discouraged practices that were against the market practice. But 1989 was another turning point, that somehow when China found itself isolated internationally because of what happened in Tiananmen, the Chinese again turned to Africa for support. Economically, we heard so much about the economic interests in China. Economically, the Chinese had to find a way to somehow get the money back. So although there were a lot of exports into China, into Africa, as part of their efforts to diversify markets, again there was a political implication in it, because of the embargo, because of the problems in the trade relations with Western countries, China wanted to diversify its export and its trade markets elsewhere. And they found Africa, they found Latin America, they found Southeast Asia countries. And they tried to diversify those exports to markets where there is less control, there is less restrictions. Remember, this is before China entered the WTO. So there were a lot of anti-dumping, that kind of restrictions in the West against Chinese exports. So they found Africa. But eventually, somehow, they found the best way to enable the Africans to pay for the goods they bought. Of course, the goods were very useful and welcome to African countries because the people could afford them. They are cheap and they are fairly good quality. So, but there was a lot of credit, there was a lot of loans, there was a lot of money going into Africa without any sign of making any return. But then there was this question of lack of resources, mineral resources as well as energy. So, in talking in sequence, you find that the Chinese are beginning to go in a big way for exploration and exploitation of natural resources in Africa as part of their deal to get the money back and to somehow make this work. But I think personally this is good news for Africa. Of course, I agree with the political problems there and the human rights and the tyranny and so on. But the Chinese eventually had to find a way to balance their trade, and they found the resources in Africa that could continue to support this otherwise unsustainable model of development, that is to produce cheap and to buy dear the materials and the resources from abroad. So I think the African countries, we have heard so much in the 80s and the 90s about marginalization in Africa, the poor education, that the Africans could never have any chance of catching up with globalization. But suddenly, because of what happened, what China is doing in Africa, Africa suddenly has a revival, and everybody is now talking about Africa being more optimistic about their future. But is that what the West has done that enable the African countries to be on their feet again? I doubt it. I think the China factor is very, very important in this matter. So I need you to actually think in those perspectives. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. At this point, I'd like to pick up a little bit on what you've just identified as the China factor there. A lot of the time, China's economic model is referred to as unsustainable. Now, moving a little bit forward, nonetheless, we're expecting to see major changes across the board in geopolitics as a result of China's expanding influence. But if China's economic model is unsustainable, logically that means that it will not be sustained, and we will see major upheavals inside China itself. There are many that are arguing that as soon as 2012 we could see some kind of internal collapse in China. Lindsey, do you think that that's what's coming, or do you think that the China factor is actually presenting some kind of alternative model in the way that Dr. Wen has just said?
I've only been in China 5 months, but I wasn't born yesterday, and therefore I will not predict whether China is going to collapse or not. Because a lot of people spend a lot of time sitting around bars in Beijing discussing this issue, and nobody knows. We really don't know. And you can look at the environmental issues, you can look at the ethnic issues, and so on, and you can predict collapse. But prediction is a mug's game, so I'm not going to do it. But what I would say is, according to World Bank figures, 400 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty in the last 20 to 25 years. This has not happened in the last 20 to 25 years in Africa, where Europe has been putting its prescription on the continent, which is, aid and trade and debt and all this stuff in the Africa Commission. The Africa Commission report made 2 references to China and China's involvement in Africa. That was all. Hu Jintao went to the G8 summit in Gleneagles. They didn't even discuss Africa with him. They didn't even think that China was a factor in any way. And this, it seems to me, is complete. Very few of the diplomats involved in this, Western diplomats, seem to me to be engaging with this issue on the level that they need to engage in it, and also accepting their own failure. And so I suppose what I think is in the sense that Europe backs out at this point. Fine, okay, Europe screwed up in Africa in the colonial period, in the post-colonial period. I agree with Brad, it may well end up in tears with China and Africa. Hey, there you go. That is history. That is what is going to happen. But I cannot predict that. I can only look at the past and say that what has happened so far has not worked. It really hasn't worked. And therefore, I can't, stand up honestly say that I can jump and down and tell the Chinese how to do it.
Well, that's fair enough. Having failed to get Lindsey to play the mugs game, I'm going to have another try, this time with Isabel.
I'm sure you're better than that.
Exactly. Nonetheless, unsustainable was your own word. And while we talked about what that might mean further, Brad has implied a little what that might mean for China's trading partners in Africa. If we could start by having a look at why possibly some people do think that the Chinese model is unsustainable, and what that might mean in the near future.
Gosh, well, it's quite a large set of questions, and I'm with Lindsey on the avoiding. China's full of surprises, but prediction is a bit of a mug's game. However, reasons for unsustainability, very large one is environmental on every front. Running out of water, running out of natural resources, increasing desertification, acid rain over a third of the territory, 80% of the water in the rivers unfit for any purpose whatsoever. I mean, I could go on. It's a very long and rather dismal list. China knows this. China's very concerned about this at the top level and at the bottom level, but there's a very large chunk in the middle which is pretty unresponsive to levers which either the bottom or the top try to pull. The 11th five-year plan, published last year, 2 years ago now, tried to rebalance the model of growth from the Jiang Zemin model, which was get rich at all costs and get rich first, clean up the environment later kind of model, which had started in the early 90s with Deng Xiaoping, in favor of what is called harmonious development. And harmonious development is code for, we have 87,000 acknowledged public protests last year all over the country. There's a great deal of discontent. This is a very brittle system. We have serious losers as well as serious winners. We have a chronic problem of corruption in the party, and we have an environmental crisis which is really quite frightening, even before you add the consequences of climate change, which are very severe for China if you think that the major cities are all on the coast, and so on and so on. So the 11th five-year plan was an attempt to rebalance in favor of a more sustainable model of growth. And there are certainly very positive moves in that direction in some ways. However, there is a problem, and that one scholar describes this as the problem of the frozen transition, which is that you start a transition in the early 90s after the shock of 1989, and it's been such a political shock that you can overcome the political resistance to get reform underway, and this extraordinary takeoff happens, and you get a very rapid development. At a certain point down that path, the people that you need to continue that process of reform have a very strong vested interest in the status quo, which is what has happened in China, so that the party, the local political authorities and the elites are all doing extremely well, and any change, any further reform, any further change would be to their disadvantage. But they are the very instrument that the government needs to prosecute further change. I mean, it's not an unfamiliar political problem elsewhere. It's particularly acute in China because you have a party whose only legitimacy is continued economic growth. There's no ideological or political legitimacy in the party. So they have to go on delivering growth. They know that the kind of growth they're delivering is unsustainable, and the levers they try to pull to change the model tend to come off in their hands. So that's the dilemma. Now, whether that adds up to collapse, I am simply not going to venture. I think it adds up to problems. I think it's a brittle system. I think it's a system politically, I think it's a system in which, a bit like, the Mexican 60 years of the you get by trading favors, essentially. And a lot of people seem to think that because you have a one-party state, you have the dictatorship of the Communist Party and so on, that there are no politics. Of course there are politics. The politics just happen within the party. And the problem is that you have a hybrid economy. It's not a market economy, and it's not a command economy. So your economic levers tend not to work. Neither the market instruments nor the command economy actually has necessarily the effects you want. So it's a very, very difficult ship to turn around. And if you have something that's heading in a direction that everyone can see, is not entirely desirable, and you're trying to change course and none of the instruments quite respond as they should, then you can see you've got a problem. And they know they've got a problem. And they know they've got to change. What they don't know is how to get from here to there. Meanwhile, in all the kind of closer to the ground problems like going back to the environmental one for a start, if you're trying to clean up, if you're trying to impose environmental regulations, you're dependent on a local bureaucracy which is in hoc to local business, or local political interests which have a direct stake in the factory that's polluting. You have an environmental agency which isn't even a ministry and which doesn't even control any of the environmental aspects of other ministries, like the Ministry of Industry or marine industries or water industry. It has no control over those. And it's worse that the local environmental agencies, which are the watchdog of the national one, don't work for the national one. They work for the provincial governor. So they're not going to, if they report against the provincial governor, they know that, their time is short. So you've got a very, very unresponsive system. And the problem, again, with that is that from below you have a great deal of discontent from the people who have lost out, who will continue to lose out. What can they do? I mean, look, if you look at somewhere like Anhui, which is a heavy coal mining province, the people who own those coal mines tend not to live in Anhui because it's vile. You wouldn't want to live in Anhui. It's unbelievably polluted. The place is just horrible. So the people who do live in Anhui are the people who have to work the coal mines and the people who have no choice. And what can they do about the misery of living in Anhui? You could sue. You could sue the coal miners for failing to observe any regulation whatsoever, except that China's banned class action lawsuits in effect. So you have to sue as an individual, which is, or I think a maximum group of 6. So, you're not going to get anywhere, and the legal system is very underdeveloped. You could go to the press, and that's one route in China. People do try to go to the press to get stories done. The press is deluged with hard luck stories. They can't take them all up, and that's pretty much pot luck. You can do what Chinese have done for centuries and petition the emperor. In other words, you go to Beijing with your complaint and you try to get attention. Tens of thousands of people do this every year. Almost none of it works. They get the runaround, they get sent back home, and when they get back home, they can get punished by the local authority against whom they're complaining. So it's not terribly effective. What else can you do? You can't vote the government out, and there's you've got no instruments. So all you can do, really, if you're desperate, is go onto the streets and protest. At which point you risk loss of livelihood, injury, death in some cases. But again, tens of thousands of people are doing this, and they're doing it against a system which finds it very hard to respond systemically. It can respond in individual cases, but not systemically.
Thank you. A lot of the discussion tends to uncouple ideology and economy, and very much the talk of the success of the Chinese economic model tends to take place as though the two exist completely separate one from the other, and that the kinds of concerns that Human Rights Watch would be raising are simply moral concerns, and then they don't necessarily feed into the stability of a society or an economy. Looking at China as it is now, we've just been describing essentially a pressure cooker situation building up, and then looking at China's broadening influence, is that there have been slight signs of resentment and that pressure cooking problem being exported to the countries that China's engaged with in Africa and elsewhere. Is that something you've been seeing at Human Rights Watch? I'm asking you whether the problems that are being seen in China with people getting out and protesting, whether the resentment against Chinese investment and what that means, China propping up corrupt or problematic governments in places like Africa, whether there's resentment on the ground there as well, and whether that's being seen by an organization like your own.
Well, there's anecdotal evidence of resentment popping up. There have been some protests in Sudan. There have been protests in Cambodia. A couple of protests I know about in Southeast Asia have been about language, people wanting to learn English and speak English in the workplace because they think that's the direction of globalization, and having to learn Chinese is disadvantaging them. But I think that's going to play out over time. I don't think that we have a lot of evidence of that yet. I think that the point I was trying to make earlier is that the Chinese are going down the same road that Western countries have gone down before, with pretty much tragic results. And I find it surprising that they have so quickly dived into the deep end of resource exploitation, for example. In the 1990s, much of China's overseas development was things like road building, school building, health clinics. They still do a lot of that. Just as we can paint Western aid with a broad brush, which is quite negative and which is well deserved, there are a lot of good Western aid projects, of course, right? The Chinese have just built a road from Jalalabad to Kabul that is very popular in Afghanistan. They've built loads of health clinics in Cambodia, which are very popular. People who don't have these things want these things. I'm quite puzzled that China hasn't chosen to stay more on the high road. I was quite surprised when Hu Jintao was in Sudan that he visited the major Chinese oil investment. It was just bad, stupid public relations. But it showed what was really on their mind, what was important to them. They also built a presidential palace for a head of state who is arguably a war criminal. Again, bad public relations. They're behaving much like the United States used to in Latin America. And this is deeply disappointing and surprising. We could pick many countries where there have been public backlashes against U.S. Behavior particularly, but the British and the French are no exception in Africa. These things will happen in Africa in response to Chinese investments. I think that basically there's a wave that's going across Africa right now, and the reaction hasn't really formed. But if the Ogoni have a Chinese oil company behaving the way Shell has, there will be a reaction, and the people will consider it to be the same problem as the last one. Meet the new boss.
And so that has already happened because MEND, which is I can't remember what they stand for, but it's the new rebel movement in the Niger Delta. Kidnapped 19 Chinese workers, didn't they, about 4 weeks ago, and held them. And basically they put out a statement saying the Chinese oil workers are just the same as all other oil workers. We don't get the profits from the oil, which is true, they don't, and therefore we think it is legitimate to kidnap any foreign oil workers, and Chinese oil workers are no different from anybody else. So they kidnapped the Chinese, and then they kidnapped a bunch of Filipinos, who were later released through negotiation. But it was the first time, I think, that the Chinese have been sort of basically told, you're just the same as anybody else.
There's one. It's also happening over dam building. There are a couple of dam building projects that I know of in Africa which were turned down by the World Bank because the EIAs didn't add up. The Chinese went in going to build them, and they involve large population clearances, when again the Chinese are having to operate with very heavy security because they're associated with these abuses.
Well, and China's also being accused of engaging in the kind of white elephant projects that Western governments were beginning to move away from a little bit. Dr. Wen, is China just making the same mistakes in Africa that Western governments were making previously, or is it really leading an African revival in the way that you suggested before?
I think there are similarities because of the way small businesses and people without any sense of international religious practices and norms are doing things in Africa. I think that's a shame and need to be pointed out, criticized. And I think the Chinese government, as far as I can tell, is responding to that sort of criticisms. When Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao went on trips to Africa, one of the messages that came out of their meetings with local Chinese business leaders was that you have to abide by the laws and respect the environmental concerns and so on. But I think, having said that, there are differences. One of the things that the Chinese are doing, not for money, has been to build the construction projects that are purely for local people's interests. Because if you think that you can make money out of building a dam, if you think you can make money out of building, highways, that's a bad business decision. That's insane. But why do the Chinese do this? Because they think that the local people will need it. Well, you may argue that these...
No, because it's very good experience for their companies, and because all the loan to Angola, the big $2 billion loan to Angola, which was guaranteed by oil, was for infrastructure projects. Now, the contracts for all those infrastructure projects went to Chinese companies. And so those Chinese companies build the roads and build the dams, and then that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is the Chinese companies getting the experience of becoming multinationals, and it's also good business for them. It's tied aid. The West has done it for decades and decades of getting projects which are for your own country's companies, and that's how you benefit.
Well, you could argue that way, but another example, for instance, is that the Chinese are building oil processing facilities in some of the countries that you cited, because historically these countries, like Nigeria, had to export crude and import oils for their cars and for their airlines and for their highly sophisticated lubricants. Why? Because there was no local processing facility. Why do you think that the Chinese are building oil processing capabilities for these countries? It's because then they will enable these countries to actually be self-sufficient in their oil consumption. So I think you have to look at the other side. I'm not saying that it's pure, selfless interest involved, but there are considerations, and I think the government is trying to push those companies to do things that would ultimately serve a political purpose. I think Hu Jintao will be a fool if the government tried to encourage companies to do things that will give China a bad name in Africa. But as you rightly pointed out, that there is a big gap between what the central government wants to do and what the local governments can do locally, and what the Chinese government wants to do as a foreign policy objective, and what the local Chinese businesses are doing to give China a bad name. So we want to distinguish between these two aspects and give Beijing a benefit of the doubt, I think.
Can I just...
Yeah, I would like you to come in at this point.
Add to that. I think one of the interesting questions in this whole discussion is the degree to which China's emergence as a real world power will change the world order, and how much it will change China's policy in the end, how much China will adapt in the end to international norms. And that's a very important question for all of us, not least Brad's outlined his concerns, but I think it's an important question in many respects. And I don't have an absolute answer to it, and I think there are signs both ways. It's interesting, Darfur, for instance, on which China has taken a great deal of criticism, because there was no UN action, there was no Security Council action on Darfur all these years while the genocide went on, because China would veto it. Well, last August China didn't veto a resolution which allowed African forces to go in, and has given some publicity to probably a mild rebuke at least, but a public one on the question of Darfur during Hu Jintao's visit. On the question of China's ambition to build global brands, it's another interesting question, because Western brands, which have been guilty in the past of their own, abuses in the supply chain, particularly when they moved to cheap labor countries, had to clean up their act, because being global brands, they became vulnerable to brand damage. And when NGOs and activists got onto this, Nike discovered to have child labor inhaling glue in its factories wherever, is a very, very damaging thing for the brand. So they all appointed human rights officers, and they all gave contracts to their supply chain factories to, which insisted that certain conditions be met, and then they had people running around, not enough of them, trying to inspect whether these were being met. Now, you can say all this is inadequate, but nevertheless it's better than what was happening before. So my question, I guess, is if China does achieve global brands, and that's, whether China will then become vulnerable to the same pressures. At present, of course, there is no means of exercising that pressure at home in China. So, you're not going to get that sort of public pressure on a Chinese brand in China. But if you're trying to become a global brand, do you then enter the same game as any other global brand? So I think that, none of this is set in stone, and China is showing much more sign of kind of multilateral sensitivity than China has in the past. And China's very near to this game in many ways. It's 15 years, 20 years. And I think China kind of came back with a sense of it's China's turn. We've had a very bad time in the 19th century. We're going to play it by our rules. And modifying these attitudes, I think that these attitudes are beginning to modify as they perhaps take on board some of the disadvantages of this behavior, which certainly Brad has outlined. You marry an unstable dictatorship, you're vulnerable.
I think there is an opportunity here that should be recognized, which is that China is quickly, I think unwittingly, finding itself in the same shoes as a lot of global powers. Its motto, its mantra is non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and that's what they say to all of us, that we shouldn't interfere. They are interfering now. They're interfering politically. They've done very little on Darfur, but they've done just enough to be guilty of interfering in the internal affairs of Sudan. They have been slow from the outside in dealing with North Korea, but they now are one of 6 parties signed up to an international agreement on North Korea that rolls back its nuclear program. That is deep interference in the internal affairs of North Korea. Their state-owned companies and the private companies that they take on trade delegations are heavily involving themselves in domestic economies. So, one thing that I think we should all think about is trying to treat China as, quote, a normal country in the ways that we have not in the past. We are, Human Rights Watch, appealing to China in the ways that we used to appeal to Western leaders when they went on trips to certain countries to deal with certain practices. China now assumes a lot of those responsibilities. I think China might decide to walk away from them. They might actually look over the precipice now and say, wait a second, where are we? We don't really want to be here. And not even say the kind of minimal things they've said about Darfur again somewhere else. But I rather doubt it. I think that they are being sucked into the global political system in ways that they are not used to, that it's enticing, that it's important to them, that these things are very meaningful to their national interests. And they will continue to pursue them. And their foreign policy will start looking very much like the foreign policy of other countries. Now, can we introduce an ethical dimension? I mean, we talk about getting the Chinese to address human rights in Burma. Well, it's not going to happen for a very long time. But they have addressed human rights obliquely in Darfur because, in the end, Darfur is not a national security interest of China. Burma is. It's on its border. So I think there's a lot of dynamics here that could be quite interesting, but I think the Chinese should be challenged and pushed to abide by, if nothing else, the international commitments that they've signed up to. They've signed up to all the good things in life. They haven't ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but they've signed it. They've signed many other international treaties, both on human rights and on other subjects. They're a party, for instance, to the Refugee Convention. They just don't implement it. So I think this is now an opportunity to actually say to the Chinese, look, which camp are you in? Are you a serious player in the international arena? Are you a signed-up member to the international system? Have you come out from the cold? Or are you still more or less a joker in the deck?
On that note, I'd like to give a little bit of time to questions from the floor. But before doing so, just to remind people, if they could identify who they are, if they represent an organization, and can I make a final plea for questions, not statements?
Hi, my name is Neha Kumar and I'm a City University student. Question for Lindsey again. I asked her earlier a couple of questions. So, you said that there's little that people can do, and perhaps also Chinese media itself can do very little in the coverage of China. Do you think Western media, if they covered some of these issues, we can bring in a bit of change in how things are done in China? And what are your views on the coverage by Western media on some of the issues regarding China? Thank you.
Well, I know that there are quite a few City University students here who I did speak to this morning, several of whom are very experienced Chinese journalists who've been working on China's CCTV, Chinese television, and China Daily. I know you're there. And of course Dr. Wan works for Phoenix TV, which is one of the most important television stations broadcasting in China and outside China. So I'm going to actually pass this one on to him in a minute. My view would be that the Western media does what the Western media does. This is our job, we report this stuff. In terms of China, what is much more important is what Chinese journalists do. And Chinese journalists are passing through the most critical phase at the moment. It is extremely difficult. Chinese journalists are being locked up. Some Chinese journalists are being locked up for telling the truth. Other Chinese journalists are taking brown envelopes of bribes for going to press conferences and for reporting favourably on certain projects. They receive money. They are as corrupt as anybody else. And others are amongst the most noble and extraordinary truth tellers that one has ever come across anywhere in the world. And this is the moment of truth for Chinese journalists. And I think that's true about what Chinese journalists report about what happens in their own country, and what Chinese journalists report on what is happening with their own country's investments and involvement in Africa, Southeast Asia, everywhere. That is much more important. We, as Western journalists, I think that we have woken up slightly late to the issue of Chinese influence in other countries. And I think that we will now run to catch up, and we will report these things, and that's very important, because it means that, finally the Europeans and Americans are waking up. Oh my God, our government's not the only players here. Hey, white people, boom, we're not so important in Africa anymore. We don't like that. I think, it's important that we report that, but what the Chinese journalists report is much more important. Dr. Wang, can I pass this on to you? Because this man is a representative of the most important Chinese television station. They're the ones, Phoenix are the ones who are pushing the boundaries.
Thank you for the kind words addressed to our company.
They weren't kind words, they were a challenge.
They were challenges as well, of course, because since we have reporters in almost all cities in China, we constantly face challenges and even harassments from local authorities against reporting and digging out stories that will be unpopular with them politically. But what I want to say is that, again, there is a gap between what the central government tends to do and what the local authorities tend to do. China is a big dilemma that apparently it is seen as a very centralized communist regime, on the basis of dictatorship and all that. But on the other hand, Beijing has real limitations in reining in local authorities, because there is a huge amount of local 土政策, local policies and local regulations, local practices, and so on. And the central ministries do not necessarily control the organizations at the various levels of government below them, because they all owe their allegiance to the provincial or metropolitan governments. And that's why Hu Jintao had to do something about Shanghai and Beijing, because it's been long overdue. But for the Chinese journalists, I think there is this problem that's been going on for some time. And I think our colleagues in CCTV and our colleagues in various publications and newspapers need to heed the voices from the people, actually, because they are not fooled. They know there's something going on there. But coming back to what we want to do, of course we have to push the envelope. We have to push the envelope all the time. But then within the Chinese system, sometimes it's not done in a way that gives rise to open confrontations. It's like martial arts. You push and they give, and then they push, you give. It's just like, a kind of shadow boxing, and hopefully in time there will be a process of evolution that will give better conditions. And I think there is some good news, maybe temporary, maybe short term, but there is still a piece of good news that because of the Beijing Olympic Games, Beijing decided to open the doors to foreign journalists. Of course, local authorities will resist, and the police and various public security regimes will still resist. But nominally, at least, as a matter of national policy and as part of obligation towards the Olympic Committee, that from January 1st, 2007, foreign journalists can go into China without having to get the approval first, and they can go to various localities without having to get the agreement or local approval from the local authorities. So I think it's a window of opportunity for us and for Western journalists to try, and hopefully when the Beijing Olympic Games is over, that the Chinese authorities are so immune or mature enough to realize that it's not a big, destabilizing problem for them, that the door will remain open.
Thank you for that. Lady at the back.
Hi, my name is Monica Elena. I'm an Italian journalist based in London. My question is more on the Africa side. It has been said that China has a foreign policy towards Africa, but Africa doesn't have it towards China. And I wonder how that can be possible, because China is a state, Africa is a continent, and Algeria with its gas doesn't relate to China in the same way that Angola with its oil will relate to China. And the same can be applied to South America. Chavez is not, Venezuela is not Peru. So how can Africa relate to that? And picking up to what the gentleman just said, what can be the role of African journalists in challenging what's happening in their own country in terms of corruption or infrastructure built to favor in some way the Chinese companies?
Okay, that's getting to be a fairly broad question, but Lindsey, I'm going to give that one to you.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, part of the issue is that Africa is 54 states or whatever, but there is SADC, which is the Southern African Development Cooperation Movement, and there's NEPAD, which is, I can't remember what it stands for, New African something. And there's the African Union. There are regional bodies. And part of the problem is that the regional bodies in Africa are extremely weak. And part of the problem is that because many governments are not accountable, the things are done for their own benefit and advantage, and that there is not enough integration of African economies and not enough integration of African political systems. And this is a problem which has been going on for years and years, and that is the basic problem, and that allows anybody, whether it's the West or China, to go in and divide and rule and to say, well, we're going to put our investment in X country and we're not going to put it in Y country unless you do this or whatever. So that's a long-term problem. And yeah, obviously the role, I'm sure there are African journalists here, and I don't know if there's anybody who wants to say anything, but their role is absolutely critical. And in some countries, like notably Nigeria, they do an amazing job on, exposing all sorts of stuff. And quite a lot of them get locked up for their pains.
I think there's somebody here from Global Witness this evening just on exactly that issue. A Global Witness researcher, as many of you probably know, was arrested in Angola about 3 days ago, a lady called Sarah Wykes, who looks as though she'll be facing an espionage charge. Is there anyone here from Global Witness? Well, in that case, there's a brief statement which I will read out, but let's move on to another question. We'll get the statement and we'll do that towards the end of this evening. So if we could go to the next question. There's a lady down here at the front.
About the human rights, and you said that you should ask the China government whether you are a serious player. But the question is who is going to ask this question, because I don't see U.S. have have softened their stand towards China, and they want to have a good trade rather than Tiananmen Square. I don't think that they will raise this issue again in their life. And the second question is about, it seems like that China go to Africa is just for business, so purely business. We don't want to interfere your internal affairs. But do you see that behind this is that China is going to build up their partners, allies? I don't know whether what term that we should describe the allies, but is it possible that they are doing something that to counter the U.S. power? The last point that I want to respond to Mr. Wang, unless China government enable Hong Kong or other European press to freely open newspaper there, otherwise, even we have a good journalist, we can't report it because local newspaper is still under control.
Okay, well, there's two questions there and a brief statement. The first of those questions, Brad, perhaps you'd like to speak to.
You're absolutely right. It's very depressing now to try to mobilize any governments or institutions to talk about human rights in China. In fact, the irony is that in a one-party state, that is a dictatorship in terms of elections and who holds power, but actually where there's a fair amount of pluralism within that, it is people in China who are raising most of the issues. Now, the Chinese people that we're in touch with are very desirous of us and Amnesty and other groups to continue doing our work. It gives them backing, things like when an 80-year-old AIDS activist is not allowed to travel and we publicize it, they reverse their decisions, so the Chinese government is susceptible to some pressure. I think this was mostly a public relations issue. It wasn't a fundamental policy shift. But it wasn't that long ago that every encounter with a Western leader led with human rights. And even people that we talk to in foreign ministries of, for instance, the 11 countries that have what are called human rights dialogues with China are very dispirited. They're very cynical, in fact, about the political leaders in their own countries being willing to raise these issues. There's a lot of lip service to it, but there is very little action, and the trend is actually likely to continue. And I actually wouldn't say this in public if I didn't think the Chinese were very well aware of this, the Chinese government, because I don't want to encourage this, but it's actually a fact. They're aware of it. They more or less have Western countries wrapped around their finger for reasons of trade and foreign policy. And yes, there will be a mild rebuke now and again. The State Department will publish its annual report. The Foreign Office will publish its annual report. But is this what George Bush, Tony Blair, Jacques Chirac are raising when they meet the Chinese leadership? It is not anymore. So it really is a case of our job as human rights people, as journalists, of trying to help open up as much space inside China for Chinese people, Chinese citizens, to raise these issues and take them up. But I can't overstate the risks people face in doing so. It is not an easy task, even to get yourself registered. You still have to actually find a local ministry or a national ministry that will sponsor you to have legal status in China. And there's not a lot of incentive for ministries to associate themselves with critical groups. But let me just add one last point, just to sort of add a little more texture to this. We should all acknowledge that in the personal sphere in China, there is much more space than there ever has been. And while there's no sign of macro political change, there's no sign there are going to be elections, they're sort of road testing some village democracy exercises, but they're not going to go any further because they're too risky for the party. That's my mug scheme prediction. People can criticize the government in their homes over the dinner tables in ways that they didn't used to be able to. There's a huge amount of criticism in the press over things like corruption, pollution, things that are safer to deal with than large-scale political change issues. And so there is a lot more space now for Chinese people to take these issues up than there ever has been. All of it, of course, very fraught with risk.
Well, I think we'll move on to another questioner, please. Lady down here at the front.
I think this is a question mainly for Dr. Wan. I'm Jill Nichols. I'm a documentary maker, not at all a specialist in this area. You started by saying that 40%, I think, of the Chinese companies that were in Africa were not... You were separating all the time these 40% of private or local businesses, you called them, from the government, whereas everyone else is talking about the government as I've always understood it, as being quite a centralised, monolithic thing. So I'm actually a bit confused, and nobody else has picked up on this, because you a few times in your speech you separated these 40% from Beijing and saying we should give the benefit of the doubt to Beijing, as though the government was somehow more benevolent, more philanthropic force in Africa than the 40% of companies who are there who are somehow private. Can you and the others explain that more?
What happened in Africa, as far as Chinese businesses are concerned, is that historically, as part of the aid projects and part of the policy to support African nations, as part of their third world solidarity, that there were a lot of people representing export-import companies in Africa doing this trade for the big export-import corporations. And later on, they all jumped to the sea, 下海了. Thus, they became private businesses. And they began to develop their own businesses. But thanks to their many years of experience and the knowledge in Africa, and their human relationships, personal relationships with African organizations and businesses, they were able to operate. But then a second group came from what I describe, manufacturers or coal mining communities and the resources communities. These people were from the local provinces and localities who had no international business experience, who had no language sometimes, and they certainly don't respect the norms of doing business internationally in a different country, to respect the local culture and so on. And they really gave the Chinese businesses a bad name, even though they are not as sweeping and generalizing as some people might suggest. But again, there are a huge number of people doing things based on their experience in China. So I think there must be a lot of work done to raise the public awareness of these companies about respect of local conditions and environmental concerns and labor rights and so on and so forth.
If we could just pick up quickly from that, for those of us who are not completely aware of exactly how things work, what the relationship between the state and private enterprises in China is, well, maybe you could speak a little bit to that very complex issue. Just lay it out for us in simple terms as possible.
Yes, it is quite complicated, but even Chinese enterprises are encouraged to go to Africa by a system of credits, of subsidies. The state does subsidize them to go and set up abroad, particularly in Africa. Small businesses, there is a limit. Is it 20 employees at the moment on private business in China? So it's hard, but Chinese businesses get around this by forming informal associations with each other. There are limits to how big a private business can get. These limits are not only a matter of regulation, but it's still very difficult to get a loan from a bank in China if you're a purely private business. The state retains an interest in most large enterprises if they're not completely state-owned. There was an attempt to get rid of the state sector, which has been going on for about 6 years, and a lot of them were turned into other businesses. However, the party and the state retain an interest in most of those. So it's a very hybrid mixture. But the state sector, I mean, if you think back sort of 15, 20 years, the state sector was 100% of Chinese enterprise. It was extremely uneconomic, a lot of it. It was, employing everybody on the, to avoid it. It served many other interests rather than just economic interests. So partly to get the deficit down, and partly because we were moving towards a kind of hybrid market economy, the big enterprises tended to be encouraged to be broken up. The workers' security went, the pensions went, the housing went, the kind of notion of a factory as a complete life support system, which is what a factory had been in China, pretty much went, or at least that was the hope. There do remain in the state sector extremely large strategic businesses, steel, energy, telecommunications, and things that the state is not willing to let go. I'm sorry, that's an inadequate explanation, but it's a large place with many different arrangements.
Of course. We're actually down to our last question, so if I can see raised hands for people who want to ask a question. The gentleman down here in the blue gets the honor of the last question.
Hi, my name is Ross Perlin. I'm here from China Dialogue. This is really for any of the panelists. And forgive something of a kind of a realpolitik question at this point, but if you're Hu Jintao right now, what countries are you thinking of as your sort of major key long-term oil and gas suppliers? And what implications will that have for bilateral relations with those countries, a la how the U.S.-Saudi relationship has evolved, for instance, over the last 70 years? Can we start thinking about what those will look like? And then maybe also added on to that, what the supply route looks like between the supplier and China, whether it's a pipeline or it's a shipping arrangement, and just some idea of what that might look like.
I think I'd like Dr. Wen to answer that question, or to do the first part of that answer.
Hu Jintao was the first Chinese leader to raise the issue of energy security in a major party conference. And of course the issue had been around for some time, but then when he took power 5 years ago, he actually articulated a policy that somehow China has no choice but go abroad to find oil resources, energy resources, to sustain the economy. Well, they tried America, and the memory of Unicol was still very much fresh on people's minds. And there was a perception that America would block anything that China wanted to do with any other oil-producing countries. We had this movie, Syriana, right? We saw that movie, that the Chinese were involved in Middle East. But America didn't stop China from buying gas and oil fields in Australia. And then in Latin America, of course, they also started pretty quickly. And if you know the Titanic, the plate, Latin America and Africa, they used to be together, and then they broke apart. So the coast along Gabon, Nigeria, that African western coast, and actually were part of the same geographical features, share the same as Brazil and Venezuela. So if talking about geography and their supply routes, they would go to Latin America, and they would certainly go to Africa, because the knowledge is such, they know that in African countries, in Nigeria and then in Angola and all that, there must be oil along the coast that share the same geological features as Latin American countries. So I think coming back to a question that was raised in the middle of this discussion about American influence, I think China had to hedge against the American influence, especially in terms of its energy security. That Russia is one, Saudi Arabia, and the Middle East Gulf countries. Iran probably is also. And then you have Angola, you have Nigeria, the African countries. That anything that will work, short of American intervention, they will do it, because come to think of it, it's a big economy, and it's been going on for last 10 years or 20 years at the rate of 10%, GDP growth. How could you possibly sustain that sort of economy without energy? So China has no choice, I think.
Well, I think that's an appropriate final word, really, on that one. It just remains for me to thank the panel for coming along and thank the audience this evening. I'm afraid that we'll have to leave the global witness.